Welcome everybody to the Gender Justice and Disaster Inspiring Action session, otherwise known as session 2 of our conference program. And before we start the session, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands of which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kaur Nation. This is where I am at the moment. I'm in Richmond in Victoria. And the traditional owners of the lands from which you all meet out there as well in the delegation, the participants who are online. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any who may be online, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So it's an honour to be able to do an acknowledgement. It's also an honour to be able to introduce our speakers here today. As I said, session 2, also known as our big session, which is a long session. And as I've said previously, that if this was to be delivered in person, it would be a powerhouse. We won't be any less of a powerhouse online. I had the pleasure of seeing 3 of the panelists recently at a live gig, and it was a wonderful event. So hopefully we can replicate that today. I'll keep the introduction short and we'll bypass some of the nomenclature that goes with normal introduction. Suffice to say, on the line today we have Dr. Niki Vincent, Victoria's Commissioner for Gender Equality in the Public Sector. Welcome, Niki. We have Associate Professor Tony Walker, ASM, Chief Executive Officer of Ambulance Victoria. Hey Tony, how are you? We have Trevor Owen, who's the Deputy Chief Officer for CFA, the Regional District of Southeast Region, Country Fire Authority. So I read that sort of reversed, but welcome, Trevor. And Curran. Brett's the Assistant Commissioner of Victoria Police and at Victoria Police. And Brett will tell us a little bit more about the directorate in which he commands at the moment throughout the course of their own introductions. We also have an online guest, or a video guest, which is Professor Maureen Fordham, and she's the Director of Centre for Gender and Disaster at the University College of London. I have quite an extensive bio here for Maureen as well, but she's a long-standing supporter and advocate for gender and disaster, and she was here in 2018 for the first of these conferences at the MCG. So virtually welcome Maureen, and we look forward to seeing her video. The panel today we'll discuss a little bit, will give us a short 5-minute rundown on where they're at, what they're doing in their own roles, in their own organisations. And then we have a cast of provocateurs. We have some people who will ask questions to the panel around the theme of who's in and who's out, which basically is the theme of the session today. And by that we're talking about in the emergency management sector, observations from their positions of leadership. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what we come up with today. I encourage people to contribute to the Q&A through the chat box, the chat feature. I'll be monitoring time, which is, you know, a bit weird for someone like me who's very bad at monitoring his own time. But hopefully we get through this without any pain whatsoever. What we will do is start by showing Maureen's video, and then we'll go into our live feedback from our leaders who are online today. So if we could start that, that would be fantastic.
So this conference and its predecessor has gender foregrounded, but again, it's the tip of the iceberg of all the considerations we should be giving. And so much lies underneath, and I don't have time to go into all of this, but you will have heard so much in this meeting already, and so much I hope that will come out of this meeting afterwards. But for gender concerns to be taken more seriously in emergency management institutions themselves, this conference is well, it's almost unique, I think, if not unique, in the kind of attention, the level of attention it gives, and at a whole range of levels. But the everyday gender violence, which we tend to give another name. So we're talking about everyday, you know, just a joke type teasing. which is a form of violence. One tiny incident you may not think is really serious, but if you live with this day in, day out, year in, year out, it has a huge impact. Gender stereotyped expectations. So we know, particularly in the fields associated and allied to gender and disaster concerns, there's a lot of stereotypical behavior, a lot of stereotypical expectations. There's still a long way to go for us to restructure working environments right from the stage of being interviewed for a job right through all of the different promotional stages, to restructure and rethink around family and care commitments, which still dominantly, not solely, but still dominantly fall on women, for example. And the unspoken, sometimes spoken resistance to female leadership roles, and that kind of resistance can manifest itself in very subtle ways. But all of these things, we could be doing more to recognize and to action. And I'm talking about all of those everyday violences happening in the everyday, but happening also in every stage of disasters. So there's a kind of question here about whether you can fix the everyday and therefore fix the disaster, and the kinds of very deep inequalities we're talking about, they're not appropriate for a quick fix. But nevertheless, there are things that can be done at a let's call it a technical policy level.
Thank you, Maureen. Maureen, we'll send Maureen a more formal thank you as well. What I will do is go back to what I was saying before about the provocateurs and the real life questions that 4 of our associates of the Gender and Disaster Pod will be asking, and I'll introduce those now. We won't have them on video, but Dr. Debra Parkinson is the manager of the GAD Pod, and she'll be asking questions in general to the panel. We'll have a chance to respond. Jaspreet Kaur is the training coordinator at the GAD Pod, so Jaspreet will have the same role, as will Leonard, who's another associate and training partner at Gender and Disaster Pod. Following on from those associates is Mary Farrow. Mary's been in the community connectedness and the disaster space and resilience space for a long time at Emerald in Victoria. So Mary will be the 4th of our contingent who will ask questions to the panel. But before we get to those questions, those real life scenarios that were the qualitative sort of tidbits and that form a small part of Deb's research and Claire's research back in 2009 onwards from Black Saturday. We're going to hear from each of the panelists now, just a bit of a five-minute summation. We know that's pushing for time when the bios are so full and we've got so much information to share. And we'll kick off by throwing to you, Tony.
Thanks, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. And again, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of land on which we're meeting on, many of the lands of the Boonwurrung people, the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Ambulance Victoria is a very interesting organisation. We go back 138 years, and I joined in 1986 in an organisation that was all men. We had no women. In fact, women, for some ridiculous quirk, were not allowed to join the organisation. We had our first women start in 1987. I'm pleased to say today that we've seen a dramatic shift over the last 30 plus years to the organisation today that has 51% of our organisation who are made up of women. But it's interestingly, as an organisation, we're often held up on a pedestal by other emergency services to have that number of women in frontline roles. It's interesting. I think we have to be really careful about that, because as an organisation, we were the beneficiary of moving to higher education, university education, where universities, by their nature, are more diverse. And so the pool we drew from was a more diverse pool, particularly from a gender point of view. In fact, we know that that women are actually passing these university courses in higher numbers than men going into and passing, which means that we've got a larger pool, particularly women, to draw from. So as an organisation, when you compare us to others, we'd say, well, we were moving ahead pretty well. We had 51% women in the organisation. We worked hard over the last few years to increase the representation of women in leadership, and saw around 38% of our leadership roles with women in them. But when you actually unpack some of those numbers, they tell a different story. They, you know, at the frontline level, I've got a significant number of women leaders in roles. But when you move into the middle management, it drops off. You move to the executive. At a broader executive, it's equal. But if you look at our operations executive, it's all men. And so it tells you something about the pathways in the organisation and the focus that we've had. It's interesting that as our workforce has changed over the last few years, it's increased emphasis on flexibility, both from women and from men. And so we've been challenged and struggling to deal with that in a way that I think we're better than we were a few years back, but we've got an awful long way to go still. And 80% of our workforce are working flexibly. And it was only within the last 6 or 7 years we were actually in the Fair Work Commission, over issues of flexibility and people seeking flexible work arrangements. So our maturity journey on this is quite narrow or short, as is a long way to go. It's interesting, our last EBA is particularly focused on the needs of more greater flexibility in our workforce. So rather than the costs of or wages, it was a very strong focus on flexibility, driven around areas such as people wanting more flexibility around improved maternity leave provisions, working around the issues of greater access to flexibility in the sense of being able to take leave out of the organisation for periods of time to do other things. Strong focus on, for example, childcare, strong focus on lactation breaks and things like that, that as an organisation we hadn't challenged ourselves on well into the previous years. So we looked at it and thought we're on a journey. We're not there, a lot of work to go. Then late last year, a number of women bravely came forward and shared their stories in the media about an organisation where they portrayed their stories, bravely told their stories of sexual harassment, of gender-based discrimination and broader cultural issues as an organisation. We've engaged the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission to do a deep organisational look at us to understand, one, why didn't I see these issues there? It's a question I ask myself frequently. And what is it I've missed? What is it that we've missed looking at that others will probably say they were there, we just weren't looking at the right things? And I think that's a right question to ask. And what we need to fundamentally change in the organisation so that these issues are called out and that we're making real systemic change so that they're addressed into the future. So we're an organisation right now. I'm looking forward to this report coming in November. It will challenge us. It will challenge and test us. It should. I expect it will shine a light on parts of our organisation that we will not be proud of. But importantly, Verioc will be working with us to implement those changes and to hold us to account. That report will be made public. The audit they do of us will be made public. And we've already accepted that we'll implement whatever recommendations Verioc put in place to make our workplace a workplace for all, an organisation that we can be proud of on every level. One that I can say from the stories I heard last year, I'm not proud of parts of our organisations today and things we need to address. So I thank you for the opportunity today. I look forward to being part of it. But as an organisation, one that we have issues that we know we must address if we're serious about being an inclusive organisation for every member of our community.
Thanks a lot, Tony. And under time too. That's incredible. Well, it's commendable. Look, it's not easy to bring up stories that you alluded to in the press because it's just not. I mean, it digs deep into the culture, and the culture. If we sit back and assume that everything's okay, well, we're assuming a lot. And I think it was a powerful step forward when you spoke in one of the engine bays or one of the car bays at on location at an ambulance station about how you were going to put measures in place to actually mitigate, acknowledge and then mitigate the issues from happening in the future. So, and that's what I heard at that other live gig I mentioned on International Women's Day. So thanks so much, Tony, for your leadership in that space. Next, someone who's not enamored to culture change at the moment, and someone who is well and truly challenged by the amount of the distance he has to cover in his the remit as a deputy chief at the CFA is Trevor Owen. And Trevor, would you like to speak about maybe some of the challenges or some of what you see as, you know, the opportunities moving forward with the culture change that's happening in the fire services in Victoria?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And look, importantly, thank you for every one of you joining us today. It's great, privilege to be here and talking with you this afternoon. Like Tony, I would like to acknowledge the Bunurong Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I'm gathered this afternoon, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I come from an industry in the fire services that typically is very male dominated. It's very stereotyped male, and that comes with a range of assumptions and myths about firefighting. And what we're trying to do is break down some of that to make sure that what you see in the movies, what you see in the media occasionally, and certainly what you see on calendars and so forth about masculine males, you know, performing the firefighting activity with an axe in one hand and rescuing a person in another with a hose and coming out of a burning building. That sort of imagery is what we, over time, really trying to break down, because in many ways it is a bit of a falsehood. We work strongly as a team of firefighters, rescuing people and saving life and property. That's what we do. But it certainly isn't a male, and shouldn't be, a male-dominated activity in firefighting into the future. And we've done a lot of work, and I'll explain a little bit of that in a moment, how we've progressively encouraging more and more diversity into the fire services. So we encourage diversity, and we need to represent, as all emergency service organisations do, they need to be representative of community. So we know that to relate to community, we need to be as diverse as the community. So we need to encourage women, other multicultural backgrounds, all genders and all diversity into the fire services, because we need to be representative of the community. That's how we connect. It's not simply about the firefighting, it's about the education, the engagement, and making communities safe. And we do that when we're really diverse and we represent community. Fire services is doing a lot with technology, innovation. We're working smarter in respect to safety and particularly health and well-being. And in doing so, that enables more and more women over time to feel confident to join the fire services, and also from other multicultural and diverse backgrounds. So the technology, the changes in equipment, trucks, and how we fight fires and we train for fires as collective teams is a lot smarter and a lot better these days than what it was 2 decades ago. So the physical demands can be overcome by techniques and improvement in the way we train and we work together to make communities safe in that firefighting and rescuing that capability setting. So the notion of being really physically masculine and having to rescue people, again, there are techniques and there are procedures and there are equipment and there is many other things that we use these days to overcome that. And in fact, doing some of those activities in isolation on your own is not something that we would encourage or train to do these days. We work smarter, not harder. We have a range of initiatives of which we're putting in place, and that includes women networks, challenge camps, leadership forums like this, where we give women the confidence to be able to step up. And over time, we want to see much more women come into the fire service, and we're encouraging that. As one chief officer said to me, he said, "I'm yet to find a job in the fire service of which a woman cannot perform." And that goes to the heart of everything. There is not a job here in the fire service that, whether it be at the chief officer level all the way through to the frontline firefighting, that women can't perform. So we really want to embrace that and get all genders and all that of a multicultural, diverse community. That's what the fire service is about. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Trevor. And, you know, we know that as contemporary fire services, exactly how you described it isn't the way it is now in present day. You know, the job description's changed a lot, and we're doing more emergency medical response now. So, and I've lamented with Tony about the fact that while ambulance does excellently, if not better than parity in their frontline operational staff that are women, you know, we could do well to pitch our role in the emergency medical response sort of realms as a job for women, because they certainly don't see that they can't be ambulance paramedics. So, and you know, the jobs are quite similar. So thanks, Trevor. It is a challenge, but proactive is what I heard there, and supportive, and you know, we've had chats about, you know, being an empathic leader as well, and how that would benefit, and how we actually recruit, and how we you know, set up our cultures. So thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Assistant Commissioner Brett Curran. If I can't think of a directorate where it wouldn't be busy 24/7 in the police force, let alone Brett's role now to do with, in light of the gender equality legislation coming into place, you know, on the back of VEOC reviews and the like. So Brett, would you like to give us a bit of a rundown on what your actually role is at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I too acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which I meet with you guys today, the Wiradjuri, and I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. And I also acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging of the owners of the lands upon which you're meeting us today. The Gender Equality and Inclusion Command, of which I'm the leader, was set up in 2019 following the 2015 VEOC review into Victoria Police's Victoria Police and its dealing with gender equality issues, predatory behaviour, and the unequal treatment that women particularly received, and LGBTIQ people received as a result of the way in which we operated. That was commissioned by then Chief Commissioner Ken Lay, and was handed to Graham Ashton, who was his successor, who then determined that we needed a special command to continue the work in order to produce sustainable gender equality. Dr. Niki Vincent was part of the launch of our 10-year strategy in 2020 December, where we outlined the way in which we're going to achieve gender equality over that period of time. I think it's important to acknowledge that we've had many goes at this. We had the first female Chief Commissioner in any Western jurisdiction, and back in the early 2000s, we were seen as leaders in gender equality. However, we didn't sustain it, and the real aim of our gender equality plan is to ensure that it's embedded in everything we do. To that end, we're looking at all our practices, procedures, to determine what, if any, either deliberately or inadvertently discriminate against women, or more pervasively, I suppose, discriminate in favour of men. I think men sometimes don't quite understand the privilege they have just by being a man, but they don't have to encounter the difficulties that women have. And Tony and Trevor have already talked about some of those issues to do with you know, being predominantly childminders or other things that we inadvertently do. One example of that is that we're reviewing our whole approach to what merit means in our organisation, and so we're looking at what selection panels value around that, and determining a definition that will enable panels to instruct all the members of that panel, but also be aware of the potential biases that they may bring into a panel, but also prepare everybody in the organisation as they come forward to know what's expected of them. We're working to reduce the, I suppose, heteronormative approach to many of the things that people expect about policing. As Trevor and Tony have said, most of what we do does not involve any form of physical prowess. Most of what we do, the best of what we do, involves your ability to negotiate, talk, calm things down, do all those things. They are not gender-specific attributes. Having said that, nor are physical prowess gender-specific attributes. It's just that they've traditionally been ascribed to men. I think the other thing we try to break down, it's difficult in a policing environment because there's a community expectation, and I'm quite often surprised by people I think are quite enlightened who just assume that you have to be 6'2", burly, and a bloke in order to do this job, and it's just not correct. So that's an important part of the work. Some of the things we're also doing is that we're looking at a place-based initiative. We've piloted 2 sites where we're working with the local area to absolutely determine what they need to do in order to improve their approach to gender equality. It's quite interesting, Steve, the forum that you saw myself and Dr. Niki Vincent at, I was meeting with some of the women who are on the steering committees of those, so they're local middle managers in those workplaces. And they were saying that prior to us going out there and them conducting an audit, reviewing how they're going, they thought they were doing fine in the gender equality space. And when they did a deep dive themselves, they thought, well, we can be much better. And I think that's the important piece of work that we're doing, is that we're trying to get respectfully and bringing people along with us, get all people to look at the way in which they're operating and say, well, what are we doing that inadvertently or deliberately by those discriminates against women or in favour of men. I think the other important piece of work that we've had going for a number of years now is our SALIS investigations, which are a place where people can go and report predatory or inappropriate behaviour by our staff, and that's thoroughly investigated in a discipline sense. So that works in also with the restorative engagement redress scheme that the Department of Justice have set up, which is about providing an environment in which we can be where affected parties can meet with senior members of Victoria Police and tell their stories and be heard as to what's occurred to them, and hopefully that provides some sort of comfort to them, but also some assurance that we are taking this work seriously. The other thing, of course, is that my command is leading the work in acquitting our responsibilities in relation to Niki's Gender Equality Act and the work that you're doing. I won't go into what that is, but that's a significant piece of work because we have a lot of outward-facing policies and procedures that need to meet the standards of the Gender Equality Act. Thanks, Steve.
No, thank you, Brett. And it's huge. I mean, I can't even contemplate the amount how you can get to each member, because it is about every individual member and how they feel comfortable in the scheme of things within the culture. Same as all the emergency services organisations, but police is a behemoth, and there's no. I mean, once again, the nature of policing has its its moments. We know that. I mean, we're talking about crime, we're talking about law enforcement. So the challenge is huge to actually keep your culture in check there too. And I'm sort of paraphrasing a little bit, but thanks so much, Brett. And on to you now, Niki. A lot of work ahead of you. I know you've been on the roadshow. I know you've spoken incessantly about what your role is and what the role of the Commission is, but it'll be great to hear it again.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Steve. And I want to really follow on from what Brett was saying about the organisations don't think they have a problem until they actually have a deep dive, have a look at it. And that's what the Gender Equality Act for Victoria is all about. There's a real impetus, and you can hear it in everything we've heard already today, there's a real impetus and energy carrying work towards gender equality. And I feel like it's really critical that we take this opportunity to create meaningful change. And I think the Gender Equality Act does that. And I'm very proud to be leading this work as Victoria's inaugural Public Sector Gender Equality Commissioner. It's just really put in place, and I'll go back a step. I've had experience as South Australia's Equal Opportunity Commissioner conducting an independent review into SA Police, similar to the work that Virioc did with VicPol. I have also done a similar review with the Metropolitan Fire Service in South Australia. So I do have some quite deep insights into these organisations, having worked very closely with them over the last 4.5, 5 years. But the Gender Equality Act put in place this framework to really break down these outdated stereotypes and the systemic inequalities that we've been talking about today, and to really achieve what slow organic change just hasn't. And Brett's talked about they've had many goes at this, and this will be the last one. I guarantee it. It requires that the public sector to provide the greatest transparency about the advancement of gender equality that we've ever seen in Victoria, or indeed in the public sector anywhere else in the rest of Australia. And from transparency comes accountability, and accountability leads us all to do better. The Act applies to more than 300 public sector organisations. That's accounts for about 11% of the workforce in Victoria, or 380,000 staff. It requires each of these organisations to conduct an audit about the state and nature of gender inequality in their organisations as at 30 June this year, and every 4 years thereafter, looking at 7 key indicators. So gender composition at the level of the governing body and at all levels of the workplace, in the workforce. Workplace sexual harassment, looking at the reports about sexual harassment and what how they were handled, what was the outcome, and also the prevalence of unreported sexual harassment. Recruiting and promotion practices, gendered segregation in the workplace, in the workforce, access to carers leave, domestic violence leave, etc., and flexible work, and also gender pay equity, or what is usually the case is gender pay inequity or gender pay discrimination. That audit will provide the benchmark against which we're going to measure progress. That data will be then taken to every organisation's workforce, their governing body, their union reps, and those the staff and the workforce will work out strategies that are going to improve gender equality in that organisation over the next 4 years. Those strategies go into a gender equality action plan, which must be submitted to me on the 31st of October this year. And then the whole process starts again, this time in 4 years. But in between that, each organisation must report to me about their progress every 2 years. So when I say that, I also, so they're reporting to me, but they're also reporting to their staff, to the public, because all of this will be published. So all of their data, their gender equality action plans and their progress reports will be published. So anyone can hold those organisations to account. In addition, organisations will also need to conduct gender impact assessments for all new policies, programs and services that have a direct and significant impact on the public, as well as any existing policies, programs and services that come up for review. And while we might think that the design of a policy, service or program isn't about gender, it actually very often is. So gender affects your needs and experiences, which means that services that treat everybody the same can actually have a very different impact on different genders in very different ways. And that might be unintentionally, but nevertheless, it can create or reinforce inequalities. And we've seen that throughout the research that the Gender and Disaster Pod has been doing, and research like it all over the world. The Act also requires that organisations covered by the Act consider intersectionality when they're conducting gender impact assessments and when they're doing their workplace gender audits. And this means that organisations are going to need to understand how gender inequality can be compounded by other forms of disadvantage or discrimination, or other identities that people have. For example, because they identify as Aboriginal, they're of a certain age, either young or older, disability, ethnicity, gender identity, race, religion, or sexual orientation. And this is the first formal integration of intersectionality into Australian equality law. And it's going to mean that equality is not just considered between two binary categories, but is formally recognised as it is, as multidimensional and complex. So this is going to require organisations to consider how they can embed gender equality right throughout the workplace and in their programs, policies and services, and how they're going to look at all aspects of equality rather than seeing this just simply as a male or female issue. It's a human issue. We know that getting it right will benefit us all, including our communities. And this is an opportunity to create cultural change far beyond the sort of compliance or box ticking that we often see when organisations are forced to do these things. And Of course, in the hopefully unlikely event that organisations fail to comply with the Act, I can enforce compliance in all sorts of ways, including right up to seeking an order from the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal directing the organisation to comply. And of course, all of that will be public as well. So, you know, another level of transparency. And the Act also provides me as the Commissioner with the power to help resolve disputes relating to systemic gender equality issues if there's an equivalent clause in the EBA covered by the class or group of workers affected by that issue. Those disputes can be brought to me as one way of potentially resolving those. Individual disputes will still get taken to VIRIOC, but where these issues affect a class or group of employees, either the employer or the employees or their representatives can bring those to me for potential resolution. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Steve.
No, thanks to you, Niki. It's refreshing to hear. It's I can sure as hell say that I don't think the word intersectionality was going to be contemplated by emergency services organisations as it will be into the future now, because it was kind of like there was this mantra that we treat everyone the same. We don't. There's no you know order of merit when it comes to an emergency response, but we know that intersectionality feeds into every part of community and inwardly into our organisations as well. So thank you so much for that. To the four of you and to Maureen, who was on video. What we're going to do now is lead into a session where we have, or we're part of this session where we have some questions from the floor, so to speak. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Debra Parkinson, Jaspreet, Liam and Mary to give us a picture of how some people are excluded from emergency services organisations. Maybe not intentionally, maybe invariably, but whatever the case, this is, as I said before, Deb's research was formed qualitatively by talking to people. So these are some of the real life scenarios that Deb and Claire heard during the course of their research. So the case studies given from men, women and LGBTIQA+ communities are drawn from the GADPOD's research, as I said, and Mary presents her community experience for panel members to respond as well. So you'll see the provocateurs come up online as they come to ask or to read out their anecdote. So firstly, you, Deb.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone. It's been really so interesting so far. I just wanted to start this by saying that I'm talking in this instance about police. It could be any emergency management organisation, and we have different scenarios throughout. So Sam has been a police officer since he left school. Now in his 50s, he's been in a bad way for a decade. On Black Saturday, he had to direct people driving down from King Lake to turn around and go back up the mountain. The advice he and others were told to give was wrong. He still has nightmares about what happened to women and kids that he sent back towards what turned out to be the terrible Black Saturday bushfires. There didn't seem to be any help available to him in 2009. He remembers trying to find out about counselling or just trying to debrief with others, but there was nothing. Some years later, he was so sick of feeling like this, he found a private psychologist and even spoke about the help he was getting at work. Word got around and he noticed that he was being treated differently. He didn't get the same respect as before. His colleagues were more distant. He felt set apart from everyone. He knows people talk about him now. They say he's not up to the job, that he's lost his edge. He feels let down by an organisation he's devoted his life to. About the same time, there were several police officers who committed suicide within the space of a couple of months. In the newspapers, the chief police psychologist suggested intake procedures may need adjusting. Sam has always brought a sense of humanity to his role in emergency services and doesn't want to become desensitised. He wonders about his own future in the police force, but also how well a tougher police force will serve the community.
So I think that's directed pretty much towards you, Brett, if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Debra and Steve. Yeah, coincidentally, with the 2015 VERIOC review, then Chair Commissioner Graham Ashton commissioned the mental health review, which was dealing directly with these issues around the services and the prevalence, but also the culture around mental health. And it ran in parallel with our implementation of the recommendations from the VERIOC review. And I think it's pretty clear that those things are parallel, in the sense that the services that were available have improved greatly. So we have Blue Space, we have a number of helplines, and we've employed a number of psychologists who are available to assist police in Sam's position. But also we've worked on the culture of our organisation around not just managers and other staff understanding the need to take care of not just their mental health, but everyone else's mental health around them, and to try and destigmatise that. Now, not saying that we've got there, we're the same with gender equality, we're nowhere near where we need to be, but our literacy around mental health has improved immeasurably. And why I say it runs in parallel with gender equality is obviously that if we remove that standard view of what policing is, that, you know, the heteronormative, the macho type guy, you know, saving everybody in a bushfire or helping people all the time, and concentrating more on what the real skills are around policing and managing emergencies and disasters, then we will improve the feel of those people like Sam, who don't want to lose their humanity. And we don't want that either, because a person who is both humane and caring will obviously almost inevitably be caring and humane around things like gender equality, cultural diversity, any form of intersectionality you can name. Those sorts of people are the very people we want to encourage to stay in the organisation and support to stay in the organisation.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. And I mean, who doesn't want someone who uses humanity in their team anyway? I mean, it kind of, I suppose that's where we haven't really historically recruited for. That is that EQ, you know, that emotional intelligence. Some of our, well, I'm not talking about any specific organisation. I'm just sort of saying that in general. So, you know, that it is incredible. And you're right about the mental health literacy. It's so important, because we talk ad nauseum about, you know, dispelling that hero narrative, because it doesn't help anyone if they know that there's an expectation that has to be a favourable outcome every time. Otherwise, they fail. And fear of failure is a huge thing. Yeah,
and I think, Steve, the other thing is that it's quite interesting when people who probably haven't been cops start talking about why police joined policing, and was to lock up crooks. I've never spoken to a cop who, of either gender, who ever said they did join for any other reason other than to help people. And so, if you join to help people, we have to work on our culture to make sure that we don't take that out of our people. We reinforce it, nurture it, and encourage it.
Niki, yeah, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thanks. I absolutely agree with everything that you said, but I do want to pick up on the chief psychologist or psychiatrist that was referred to in Deb's case study, talking about the need to look perhaps a bit more carefully at the kind of people that are recruited into the organisation, as if there's something wrong with someone who you know, has a perfectly normal human response to a terrible, tragic event. And I'm picking up on it because I've only recently heard it, and I'm not sure. I think it was as a result of the suicides of the people coming out of war zones and so forth. And there was a comment just only on the radio a few weeks ago by someone in the force talking about the fact that we might need to look at our recruiting, and, you know, almost as if we have to recruit people who are tougher, who don't have mental health issues and end up suiciding, which is the opposite of what needs to happen. It's another example where we expect, for example, we expect women to shape themselves to fit into these organisations. And here is an example of we expect men or anyone to fit themselves into these organisations instead of saying it's the organisations that actually need to change. And I wanted to raise that only because I've just heard it so recently in the last couple of weeks.
With a bit of luck, we might be able to weave a little bit about what the media, how the case the media prosecutes about what it takes to be an emergency responder. So we'll move on to the next. Jaspreet Kaur is here now to ask a question. Jaspreet, from here.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, everyone. And thanks, Niki. That's a great segue into my part in this conference. So my case study is Sophie is 19 and was one of 5 women recruited as a career firefighter a year ago. This was the biggest intake of women ever. The aim of this fire service is to increase women from the persistent 3% women for decades to a modest 6%. Even that seems almost impossible without affirmative action. Sophie remembers her excitement when she heard she'd been accepted. It had been a lot of hard work to prepare for the intake assessment and pass the physical aptitude test, and she did it. She loves her job. She loves the challenge of it and knowing she is in a trusted profession where she can save lives. However, the day-to-day survival is hard and getting harder. At first, the 30 new recruits didn't seem to see her or the other 4 women any differently. They were one cohesive group eager to learn. But over the past 12 months, the sexist attitudes she noticed straight away from the older fireys seemed to be taking hold on her peers. Not just attitudes, but she and the other women don't get the same opportunities as the males in her group. Even worse, she's noticed that a couple of the women in her group are behaving in ways that are more macho than the worst men, even making sexist comments to get on the good side of their colleagues and bosses. She's tried speaking to her officer in charge and women who have been in the organisation for a long time. They all say the same thing. If you want to be in the best job in the world, you have to make a few sacrifices. Or they tell her to toughen up, or that she has to try harder. She knows she's as good as the guys and it doesn't seem fair to her. She doesn't want to make a formal complaint because she'll be seen as a troublemaker. Sophie is starting to think that she'll never have the career she dreamed of and instead will end up doing the soft, maybe less physical parts of the job and always being seen as not getting the same opportunities as the men she works alongside. She's thinking of leaving. How can emergency service organisations like fire, ambulance and police change the macho culture that sidelines competent employees like Sophie? How can these emergency service organisations eliminate gender-based discrimination? Thank you.
Thanks, Jaspreet. And I'm sure Tony and Trevor have something they'd like to contribute here.
Yeah, thank you, Jaspreet. The first thing that stands out to me is this issue of everyday sexism. The issue that that when we sit around mess room tables, particularly as men, and we allow those comments to occur and not call them out, then we're making them permissive. And the role that we play in, and particularly as leaders, in actually calling out those snide jokes, things that historically were just talked about, where they're disrespectful to women or anyone from an organisation, we have a critical role in doing that. So that's the first thing from my perspective. So we need to talk about it as men. We need to acknowledge and particularly as leaders, be the people prepared to actually say, no, that's unacceptable. When all of us start doing that around the mess room table, you do start to see change. It's not easy, but it's critical. The other thing for me is push the successes. So, in our organisation, majority of women staff now, frontline staff are women, and it's about showing how they can do the work they do. It's about looking at your data. I mentioned before, it's a bit of a risk sometimes when you've got 50, 51% of your workforce made up of women, you can get complacent. I've got to say my board never allows me to get complacent, and I was challenged by my board chair a few years back, or a couple of years ago, about, that's great, Tony, really good. Can you tell me how many women we have working on the helicopter? And I had none. And it led to a bit of insight from me and looking at our team and going, well, why? Lots of excuses of why from people, but why? We now have 2 women working on the helicopter, another one with training, and have worked very hard to address that. But I've got to say, it was a blind spot to me. I'm looking at some of this other macro data telling me something. So that's the thing. Where are women in your organisation, and the question, if they're not in the normal roles, any role in the organisation, the question has to be asked of why. The other important thing here is to create the opportunity for Sophie to have a pathway to raise a complaint where she doesn't feel that her career is impacted. So confidential pathways where she has the ability to talk to people and to raise those issues legitimately, as she should have the opportunity to do, are really critical as well from my perspective. And looking, obviously, as we talked a little bit about a few of us today, the processes around how you recruit. What are the bias that sit in the recruitment processes? If the people that Sophie's talking about are on the panel selecting people, they're going to look like them. They're not going to look like Sophie. So that's a critical part of how to have a look at the work around that as well. So yeah, they're my initial observations to Sophie's story.
And Trevor, if it's not, I mean, retention's a huge thing in any of the emergency services organisations because there are inherent stresses with the job, and we're talking shift work and whatnot. So what about the overlay of a volunteer who may walk away even easier because they're not being paid? So if they are subjected to the same sort of treatment, retention of volunteers has to be a huge thing as well.
Oh, look, as emergency services, and certainly in the CFA case, volunteer organisation, we are the community, and we need to represent the community, as I spoke about earlier. It's important that connection is people, real people, providing their services to save life and property, made up of a community. So we need to be representative. And what's disappointing in this story is that the investment by the organisation, the person and recruiting and going through and not getting the right support mechanisms within the fire service and within the agency has created an environment where somebody's thinking about leaving. And that's really sad because that's not good for the future of the fire services. But importantly, as Tony touched on, it is about creating those pathways. It is about a leadership issue and making sure that we're calling out the bad behaviour. And for those who might be the 30-year veterans, clearly that just because you've been in the job for 30 plus years doesn't make it acceptable. You don't own the organisation. You don't own the standards as far as setting those about what you think it is. It is about representative of what the organisational and the newer contemporary standards look like into the future as they change and as we evolve. But for me, it's also about education. We need to make sure we're in emergency services. We have people that often start at a younger age and go through and even retire in the one service whole of life. How well are we educating them about the standards of behaviour, but the right environment, the inclusive environment, and how we can support, in this case, a woman coming into the fire service who's giving her time, her effort in a career, and is obviously not getting a good experience and is considering leaving. And that's a really sad indictment. That's something that we have to change because those stories are real and we need to face up to those and we need to own those. And we need to do that through strong and good leadership at all levels.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. We'll move on to the next provocateur, Leonard. Liam's an associate and trainer at the GADPOD as well, and Liam has another proposition and anecdote to share.
Hello, and again, thank you to all the speakers. I'm the LGBTIQA+ provocateur, to use Steve's comment. My example is very short, but it does dovetail with the issue raised by both Maureen and I think Tony, looking at the sort of small everyday slights that minority groups face and people not realising the impact of a single small incident in someone's life. And it also relates to the issue about how organisations maintain their volunteer base. So this is my example. Liz and her partner Sonia recently moved to a small country town. Liz decided to volunteer with the local fire brigade to meet people and contribute to the community. However, the half-day session opened with a violent, slow-motion video of a boxing match, followed by a number of sexist and homophobic jokes from a number of other participants. The jokes were encouraged by the two senior representatives of the emergency services overseeing the volunteer training. Liz felt unsafe and unwelcome at the session. Liz has been subject to homophobic and sexist bullying in the past. She decides not to report the incident, aware that she might be seen as a bad sport and making a mountain out of a harmless joke. Liz and Sonia are not out in their community, and Liz's experience has made them both wary of being open. Liz has decided not to attend future training sessions and is seriously considering not joining the volunteer fire brigade. That's me.
Well, yeah, thanks, Liam. And I mean, I kind of put to the prospect forward that formal reporting is that it is formal, and it puts it on the record, and it puts pressure on the person that reports as well. So I wonder in the organisations if there's a less formal way that we could report instances of, say, sexual assault and get still get a positive outcome without people feeling the pressure that they're going to be targeted, they're going to be outed as a you know, a snitch or a dobber or whatever it is. So anyone can follow on from that, from Liam's anecdote there. It was about volunteerism once again, Trevor, if you wanted to.
Oh, look, importantly, we need more volunteers in Victoria. I mean, that's what we built on in Australia. We're a strong volunteer culture, but we've got to create the right environment. We've got to be able to make that environment that doesn't see what we're seeing here, which is a potential loss of a quality member who could be joining the fire brigade and is suffering as a result of a poor culture. And again, that ultimately impacts not only in the fire service, but that also impacts on community, on safer outcomes for community. So, you know, when you look at the story here and you write about the reporting of the incident, and again, it's about calling that behaviour out, you know, we've got to make sure that the systems, the processes, the support mechanisms to build the right culture, to make it inclusive, where people feel that they can have the confidence also to speak up, but others call that behaviour out before it gets to that point.
Would anyone else like to comment on that, the plight of Liz in that last story?
I feel like it's along the lines of what we've already said, you know, that culture that rejects anyone other than a sort of white macho male, regardless. Women, people with mental health issues who are seen as weaker, you know, anyone who's different, LGBTIQ people, you know, other races, even vegetarians are, you know, rejected in that culture. You know, it's a mammoth thing to change, and you know, I would say rather than putting the emphasis on you know, the person to report it, those people training that cohort should not have been in that role. If the organisation doesn't know what's coming out of the mouths of their trainers that is reinforcing this really negative culture, then it shouldn't do.
Yeah. So, and I think about people feeling accepted in organisations, and organisations get the opportunity. And I mean, Gay Pride marches coming up, and I know that emergency services feature, you know, heavily in the Gay Pride marches. But it's a matter of that you can see what leadership is there as well, and you can see what mechanisms are in place. I mean, I've spoken to the gay lesbian liaison officers at police, Brett, and their function is just fantastic. I mean, it's a group that are visible as well. So it's not like that you've got to go behind closed doors to speak to someone for assistance. So that's a huge field for the police.
Yeah, look, I think that's right, but I do think that the very people who behave like that are the people who are more likely to dominate a room, and the culture that you need to create is a culture where those people don't feel welcome to behave like that in any room. And that's a complex thing to achieve. If we look at broader society, we're concentrating on emergency services at the moment, but if you look at what's going on now, if you had have said 20 years ago that we would be having the discussions we're having around the entire country around these issues, then you'd be shocked. In fact, you know, I'm just lamenting the fact that very recently we had massive march on Parliament in Canberra around women's equality, and yet we've got media articles where men who perpetrated activities against women are being portrayed as somehow victims just here in Victoria. So we've got a long way to go as a society. The emergency services take this very, very seriously. And I think the most important thing is that we recognise that we haven't always done well, both in gender equality, but also LGBTIQ. Again, we've been involved in Pride. We've had glows for 2 decades now, and still there's homophobia in our organisation. And so we have to make that something that's just unacceptable to everybody.
It goes to the bar that people in positions of power set outside of not just the emergency services organisations. We're talking about politics, we're talking about actors, we're talking about performers. The bar gets set really low. So, you know, there's people, and we can't expect marginalised groups or underrepresented groups to keep on coming forward when we know that they're just going to keep on getting pushed back. So if I could call on Mary to come into the group now. Mary Farrow, the Director of Centre of Resilience in Emerald, has a question. Community-based question, maybe, Mary? We'll see.
You bet. It's community-based. I'm from the scary community. So it's a little bit different approach. It's coming from the outside to join in working with emergency management. So my case study is brought to you by SDG number 5. Claire is the director of a large community-based childcare center in a cyclone risk area. Having to create an emergency plan per center and having experienced a damaging storm event raised her concerns about planning and risk management. Her center was cut off due to road closures, flooding, and loss of power, and she wondered whether she could participate in some kind of local emergency planning and share her experiences. She investigated further and found that there was indeed a municipal management planning committee in her area. So she made contact to see if she could join the committee. She was told that the committee was not accepting any new members. Now, when Claire asked further about whether there was some kind of civilian type role that she could participate on, she was told that they already had a local member from an emergency service that was a woman, and that her needs would be represented by this particular member. Claire asked whether this person was familiar with the needs of care providers in her area, but there was no further information on that. So Claire felt that while it was beneficial that a woman from an emergency service was in the planning group, it seemed that the inclusion of other community-based women was not needed and was dismissed, almost like a box response. When Claire offered that she could bring different experiences and would still like to serve on the committee, she was told that, well, if we let you join, we'd have to let every other community group join. Now, it really raised a vision in her head whether there were throngs of volunteers lined up to join the Municipal Emergency Planning Committee. Most people never heard of one. So she thought that the inclusion as a civilian type of person, a non-emergency person who doesn't speak the lingo, should be welcomed and actually sought after. She felt dismissed and discouraged from taking it any further. Did some research and found that the majority of care work, even in Australia, is done by women. She worries about the gaps left by the lack of representation in emergency planning. She further read about the horrific experiences of women in Mozambique after the cyclone event and how completely different the outcome would have been there for those women had their knowledge and experience been part of the planning process. Surely inclusion of women ought to be built formally into planning from the beginning. Claire's question is, how can effective inclusive planning take place when local women providing care are not considered as hands down absolutely essential members of municipal emergency planning committees?
Well, thanks, Mary. Niki, would you like to lead us off with a response to the scenario there?
Yes, I'm sorry if my internet is working. I've now had to come in on my phone, so my apologies for the disruption. And I only heard half of the scenario, but I had the benefit of seeing it before. I think what we've really got to, and one of the things that the Gender Equality Act does is brings in the requirement for organisations to conduct gender impact assessments. So they're going to need to look at everything they do that has a direct and significant impact on the public, and this would be one of them, where they're assessing what needs to be done in a community around emergency preparedness, and think about it with a gender lens, with a an intersectional lens over it, and so this scenario is a perfect example of why that's necessary. It's ridiculous to presume that this person couldn't contribute, when in actual fact she's exactly the sort of person who you would want to be part of disaster or emergency planning and management.
And this, excuse me, a session that we did earlier spoke to Jaspreet and I earlier with the Sydney domestic violence cohort. They spoke about community connectedness the whole way through, not about sector specific expertise or subject matter expertise. They spoke about the need for community to be involved. Would anyone else like to share their reflection on that last story?
I think as emergency services, we have a phrase that we use now, and we work as one. Now, if you've gone back a few decades, we just did our own thing. We didn't work as one. We just, fire brigade went to the fire and ambulance did its thing and police just did its thing, and somehow it all sort of happened, but it didn't happen well at all because it wasn't an inclusive environment. It didn't bring people together. So nowadays we work as one, and by extension of that, I actually wonder whether working as one is with the community ultimately. We often use it as emergency services to bring us together, to say that it doesn't matter whether it's a fire, flood, or any other disaster, we all contribute something to the emergency, and we all communicate and engage and get the job done and help one another. But this is an example where working as one goes well beyond that, and it is about working as a community, as a society as one, in supporting one another through what are fires, emergencies and tragic events. And by extension, it should include, because the more that people can offer another lens that's not in the emergency services, that understands the risk environment that they operate in, why would we not want to include them? Why would we not want to understand so that we can respond to the risk appropriately?
Yeah, I know a lot of work's been done in the fire services, particularly about community-led resilience in bushfire or flood, disaster-affected areas. Putting the control back to community, where a MEMP or a municipal emergency management planning committee is a really important part of that. And I know Mary could speak forever about how community can contribute to effective community-led resilience planning and recovery planning particularly. In the urban context, it's a little bit different. They sort of, I remember we spoke to a group once and they sort of said, no, you'll be there, you'll do it for us, because it was the urban environment. There are services, they were well catered for by services, by dozens and dozens of services, and there was no sense that, and we're talking about like a heat wave scenario as well, not necessarily a disaster like a flood or fire in the urban environment. So it was quite interesting. Anyone else like to reflect on that last anecdote? And there's no question that people rely on local government, and the municipal emergency management planners have a hell of a job to stay, in touch with, particularly in the response phase of the PPRR continuum, and then, leading right into recovery. I mean, they operate right across the continuum. So I met some just last week at a relief centre scenario that we were a part of, and they're pretty protective about their role in the scheme of things, but they're also, pretty astute at seeing where there's value to be added from people from community, I'm sure, and from non-subject matter experts, so to speak. Mm. We have questions from the floor if no one else wants to contribute to that anecdote there, which is absolutely fine. There's a couple of sorry, I could actually work backwards a bit because this one jumped out at me, and it's to you, Brett, regarding something you may have said earlier in regards to merit. An anonymous attendee wants to know if you can talk a little bit more about redefining merit, what that looks like.
So we have a traditional approach to viewing merit in Victoria Police, which is generally around what people have done in the past and what they've achieved, as opposed to what their potential is and what they can do. And to that end, for about the last 15 years, nearly every rank of our sworn personnel have had to apply for a job with 6 key selection criteria. The first of which is employs policing skills. Now, it doesn't say that that's the most important key selection criteria, but it is number 1. And that key selection criteria quite often will detrimentally affect women who might have gone on parental leave, might have had to take certain roles to do certain things, and so therefore haven't done the what some people would say were the traditional operational policing approaches. The other thing around the merit discussion is many of us view merit through the lens of what we are, what we're good at. And if your organisation is predominantly male, Anglo-Celtic, then and all the attributes that come with that, then quite often you're gonna approve of that. You know, just without any sort of work to try and stop you doing that. But it's more than that. It's a systems-based approach that we're looking to with merit. We need to look at how we prepare people for the selection process that we're going to introduce, and then we need to prepare the organisation and the selectees for what in some cases will be the inevitable backlash from that. Or interestingly, in Victoria Police, still, notwithstanding the fact that women are promoted in less percentages, commensurate with, there's about 35% of our workforce is women, and they're still promoted less than that 35%. There's still a view that women are getting jobs just because they're women. It's just not right. I think another thing around the merit discussion is that we have to talk to women. Many of you might have seen some literature and listened to some discussion around the fact that when women apply for jobs, if there are 10 attributes, they generally won't apply unless they've got 7 or 8 of them. There are many men who apply when they've got 1 or 2. And so, we've got to educate the men, but we've got to talk to women about that you don't need to have ticked every box before you can go for a job, that your potential is sufficient. And so that's a broader piece of work around the merit discussion. So it's not just defining merit, it's a systems-based approach to ensure that we're making the fairest and best decisions around that, and that we have a true meritocracy, not just a view that we've chosen the best person because we say we've chosen the best person.
Yeah, and there could be construed that there's an issue with tick box interviews and tick box promotional processes where you're more inclined to engage in a conversation to show the value you have as a leader in a position of leadership, rather than to see how you look on paper. Look, if I could, I've got a question that I can sort of draw from something from all 4 of you, if I could. So it sort of goes to where we're at as far as the certainly Niki's commission. Research reports and inquiries into many male-dominated organisations such as police, emergency services, fire, military, ambulance, find a culture problem where gender equality, diversity and mental health issues are not addressed well. So I put it to you that in 2030, the culture problem is resolved. What happened? What has your organisation or the sector done between 21 and 30 to bring about this positive change? And what are the barriers to making these changes? So it's kind of a rose-coloured glasses view into 2030. So who would like to go first, is to say how they're going to fix, maybe not the problem, but the status quo?
Well, I'm happy to kick off, Steve, if you like. First up, I think if you don't know what the problem is, you can't fix it. So for me, you have to have a look at it in detail and in depth, and you can't do that yourself because you look at it through the same biases you look at the way you're running the business today. So, whilst I'm, I mentioned before, deeply distressed by what occurred last year and what was reported, it's been a catalyst for change for our organisation. I have absolute faith that, having Veriok in our organisation, having deep dive and publicly reporting and holding us to account will ensure that these things change. You know, the old Einstein quote, you know, you try and solve the problems of the thinking of today and wonder why you haven't got a change. It's the same principle. We're part of the problem of the organisations today. We need someone else to help us who actually can have a good look at us and paint a clear path. And we need to be held to account for that publicly. We need to invest in those issues and deeply understand them. Until we do, we won't change. So for me, I think our journey started many years ago with changing gender diversity and inclusion in our organisation. It will fundamentally change on the 30th of November when we receive the report from Berioc that will set forward a path on what we need to change. And we're committed to and up to that piece of work. I think without that, we'll keep meandering along. And people will make choices not to be part of our organisations unless we've made those changes to be truly inclusive and representative of what they need to and should expect of a modern public sector organisation.
Can I lead on from there?
Absolutely, Niki.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think if in 2030, what I'd love to see is that these organisations just look much more like the communities they serve. So they'll be equal, if not 52% female, from diverse backgrounds, First Nations, other racial and religious diversities, LGBTIQ people and people with a disability, working throughout emergency service organisations equally and feeling safe to bring their whole selves, every part of their identity to work. And in fact, their diversity will be valued and utilised to help create more innovative, future-focused and high-performing organisations. And I think to get there, there'll have to be, I mean, these organisations were like many organisations throughout society, designed by men for men. There has to be a redesign. We can't keep trying to tinker around the edges. It's not serving men, it's not serving the men who work in these organisations, as we know from all the mental health issues and the suicide issues and so on. And it's not serving anyone else, and it's not serving the community. And these are public service organisations. And I feel pretty passionate about that. If you're a public service organisation publicly funded by taxpayers' money, you have to serve, you have to look like the community, and you have to serve the whole community, not just treat everyone the same as if there were this kind of, you know, same community out there. So I think there's got to be, you know, this injection, and as Tony said, this getting others to have a look at these organisations and think about, well, what if they weren't designed by men for men? What would they look like? We wouldn't have inferior organisations. I guarantee we wouldn't have inferior emergency services if women were the ones leading them. It would just be different. Just as good, but different. So getting others to come in and have a look at these organisations and think about how they need to shift to make them more reflective of the communities that they serve. It's not an easy thing. I don't honestly think it's going to happen by 2030, but if I had my way, that's how it would certainly look. And it's quite an exciting prospect for me, I think. And you know, I know that everyone here today wants change, but I'm worried that the kind of change that we're focused on is a bit of tinkering, and that the kind of cultures, these very entrenched cultures within organisations, take a massive time to change, and tinkering's not gonna get us there fast enough.
No, absolutely, and I agree. And if I hear the case in the emergency management sector, that is, there's no fiscal bottom line for the case for diversity. It goes to our culture, directly to the culture. But if I hear someone making the case for diversity one more time, I'll lose it, because it's been made. We know what we need to do in our cultures. You've just outlined it again, Niki. So it's a matter of, you know, what mechanisms we put in place, strict mechanisms in place that actually, you know, that actually does it as business as usual, basically. But what I can say, by October 31, 2029, things will be looking really well, because that'll be the third iteration of everyone's report back into the commission. Fred or Trevor, would you like to comment on that? There is a question here I want to get to. It sort of goes into a little bit about what we're talking about, organisations who are run by the patriarchy, basically. And I'm sure that didn't come from my colleagues at Women's Health, but we'll get to that after you say something, Trevor, now. Sorry.
Yeah, so I've got a prop. It's our 10-year plan, which coincidentally finishes in 2030. So Equal, Safe and Strong lays out what we intend to do. I'm not being glib when I say that if by 2030 we've got there, then the plan worked. And that's what we want to have achieved. We set the 10-year timeline because we knew that if we didn't, as I said at the start of my discussion here on this panel, that if we didn't actually try and embed all those things, not just tinkering at the edges like Niki said, and as you've said, Steve, tick boxes, we just can't do that. We have to look at the systems and the approach of the organisation that has meant that it favours men in the way in which it does. So that's the way in which we achieve that. The other thing, of course, for our organisations is that we have to be an attractive proposition for women to come and join. We're still tracking between 32% and 39% coming through the door wanting to be police. I think it's better for Tony, but for Trevor and for you, Steve, it would be a little bit less. And for us, it's about what are people seeing about our organisation that they're saying, well, that's not for me, because we can't grow our sustainability unless we have people coming through the door. And again, that goes back to what Niki said, which is that piece around the organisation appears to be an organisation for men, designed by men. So we need to communicate with the broader society and tell them that, or let them know that we are different to that the traditional view of what police do is not what you see on the nightly news, or not what you see on CSI or whatever cop shows running at the moment. I'm not much of a cop show watcher, but I'm sure that they still do have a very strong focus on those hard-edged attributes that are not what police traditionally use most of the time.
Thanks, Brett. Trevor, I know your mic's open now. I was going to say, whilst the case for diversity has been made, I could listen all day to the case for inclusion, because I think that's when we're talking about action. That's when we're talking about strategies and to get people into the organisation that aren't readily reflected within the organisation. So sorry, Trevor, I almost cut you off there.
No. Thanks, Steve. Tony's absolutely right. You know, we acknowledge that we've got challenges. We own those challenges and we lead to resolve them. And I think that's the first step. And we stick our hand up saying, yep, we've got some challenges and we're going to work hard to resolve them. I like Niki's approach where it's exciting times. And that's the way we should be looking at it, half glass full, saying, you know, we're going to change and we're going to put plenty of enthusiasm, passion and motivation into making sure that the momentum that we're seeing over the past few years will continue just to grow. Because I reflect on my career when I came in as a firefighter over 25 years ago, and I see where we've come today. And whilst we've improved significantly, we're nowhere near where we need to be. But in the last few years in particular, I can really see a momentum for change here. And I think that the next few years ahead of us, we're going to see that big incremental step that we've all been waiting for so long. I think the society can feel it, we can feel it, we're getting there. And as I said, I think the next few years are going to be really exciting times. And I like that sort of viewpoint from Niki, because I think if we embrace that and keep the momentum, keep it front of mind, keep discussing it, talking about it, raising it, and calling it out for what it is, you would like to think in the next few years we'll be much further advanced than we've ever been before.
Yeah, once again, I agree. I agree with just about everything that's been said. I'd just like to go back to Maureen, and Maureen said it in a video, fix the everyday. You know, if the everyday things are broken, we need to fix the everyday stuff. So it's just to, you know, we just get on. It's a matter of just getting on once we fix what's not right. And would anyone else like to comment on what we just touched on? There was once again, it was a question on patriarchy, which would be remiss if I didn't. It's got the most likes, most hits to be asked. So how can these organisations embed a gender transformative approach? For example, this type of change needs to challenge patriarchy as a system, and these organisations are often based on patriarchal systems. I'm not sure if we've covered off on that, but certainly Dr. Vincent, you may have something to say about that.
Yes, absolutely. I think that the sort of work that we're talking about doing now is one step towards that. I think it's probably a bridge too far for a lot of people who are embedded within and, you know, have grown up within a patriarchal system, women and men and other people of other genders. We're swimming in it. We don't even notice it. It's why we sometimes don't notice things that are going wrong that we afterwards feel well we should have noticed in our organisations. But I think we will get there through some of these approaches that we're already taking, bringing gender lenses, bringing other diverse lenses, talking about inclusion and what that looks like, rather than holding up patriarchy and expecting everyone to instantly see it and understand what's been going on. I think that's useful. It's a useful approach, and I'm absolutely all for gender transformative approaches. But I think when we're talking about fire and emergency and very strongly male-dominated organisations, that the steps that we're beginning to take are going to uncover that as we work through it and get stronger and stronger.
Fair enough. Thank you, Niki. There is a question here from Kat, and I'd like to read, why do we think we can't see these issues until they go external or are raised on a mass scale? What are we missing? Is it just a few bad apples or a subculture? Why do emergency services and army, etc., seem to attract these issues or be more prominent with these issues?
Thanks, Steve, and Kat for asking that question. I don't want to sound defensive, but it's not just us. We're focusing on emergency services today and the army, and we've been very public about the reviews that we've done into us, but I think we're part of a broader problem in our society, in particular in Australia. I think we thought we'd come a lot further than we had, but the best thing about what these organisations are doing are that they are opening themselves up to these reviews. That doesn't therefore mean that we are doing well, that we're automatically going to be better because we've somehow rip the scab off. I'm not saying that at all, and I'm also very careful not to be defensive about this, but all of our organisations operate within the community in which they serve, and particularly where you have a volunteer base that operate in particular rural, semi-rural communities where there might be a view about what men and women's roles are in those communities. And so we have to take account of that when we're dealing with the issues that we have. For instance, it shocked me less than a year ago to find out that the Agent just appointed its first ever female editor. That's in this state, that's one of the most progressive media outlets we've ever had. And that was just a shocking thing to hear. I'm not saying the Age is not a gender, not committed to gender equality, but it just was quite a surprising thing. And so I suppose for us emergency services organisations, we exist to serve the community. We exist to deliver to the community. And Niki made it's the most obvious point of all, is that if you're not representative of that community, it makes it more difficult to service it, to be trusted by it. In policing, our biggest single threat to community safety is domestic violence. So family violence, women and children subjected to violence by men in the main. If we're not trusted to perform that role, then that is a major failing of our organisation. We've set up the Family Violence Command, we've set up the Gender Equality and Inclusion Command in order to address those concerns so that we better serve our community. And the other thing I'd say about Equal, Safe and Strong, our plan, one of the outcomes that we're absolutely focused on is that we are far better at dealing with harm to women and children in our society. That's one of the outcomes we want to achieve. as soon as we possibly can.
And if nothing else, from my experience in the family violence sector as well, and I've been in it and quite close to it for a number of years now, is that the emergency services organisations absolutely belong in that prevention of violence realm, because we see things, emergencies for instance, and I saw one of Tony's staff sent me a document recently about how ambulance were tapping into the Marram scenario, so about information sharing. I heard from one of our officers once that if we see something, it means that we then own it and we need to be able to do something with it. And I said, yeah, that's the premise of information sharing, knowing who you should share that information with, because if we're attending scenes that we recognise as being a domestic or a family violence or a gendered violence or whatever, domestic abuse, whatever you want to term it, we need to be able to refer that on. And we need to be there looking at our colleagues in police and ambulance and them all having confidence in us seeing the same thing, because we've been trained in identifying family violence. Tony, have you got anything you'd like to comment on that?
Steve, look, on the family violence piece, if you're talking specifically about that, look, I agree with you. I think it is critically important for us to recognise that the privileged role we play in the community and how we can, through the sharing of information, through being sensitive and understanding what we're seeing, that we can make a difference to help improve the safety of the people we're attending more broadly than our traditional roles that are out there. So we play a broader role. Again, this privilege of being invited into people's homes every day does give us an opportunity to see things that otherwise will not be seen, and to do things with that. So I agree completely with you and what you're talking about there.
Yeah, and that's precisely what I'm saying. Look, if anyone has any closing remark or comment they'd like to make, feel free now. There are a number of questions in the chat that we obviously won't get to because time is pressing. What I'd like to say is that I acknowledge your positions in your organisation and the time that you've given today, and the fact that it's not just today, it's a little bit of planning or a lot of planning leading into this as well. I get this, and I was really excited, and I was quite honoured to be asked by Deb and the others at the GAD-Pod to facilitate this session of sorts. Facilitate of sorts is what I meant, not session of sorts. So it really is a great feel for me when I go away and talk to our organisation about these discussions. What I can give a short plug to is that, Niki, thanks so much. You'll be speaking again at an emergency management conference in July, and I'll remind you of that a couple of times, don't worry, where you deliver the Claire Zara oration. Now, Claire was one of the researchers who, once, as I said earlier today, passed away in 2015, and we have a dedicated oration at an emergency management conference in Melbourne, and Niki will be presenting that in honour of Claire, basically. So we've also got our training's been recognised nationally now. We're rejigging the gender and emergency guidelines that having breastfeeding and pregnancy factored into it now. So this space is morphing all the time, and this session today, once again, I really appreciate it on behalf of the organising committee of the conference, has been a great insight into what you all are thinking as leaders of your respective organisations. So I thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks, Brad. Thank you, Trevor. And thanks for everyone that was listening and participating at home or at work. Cheers.